If your carburetor was not adjusted properly, make the necessary changes and reinstall it on the engine. Once reinstalled, if it still will not start up and idle smoothly, or if the carburetor checked out okay when you went through it, the carburetor is probably not the source of your current frustration. However, feel free at this point to call the Demon Tech line. Make sure you have your engine specifications handy to help with the troubleshooting. Even though the float level or fuel level has been preset at the factory, I want to go over this adjustment with you real quick. Now, we recommend this adjustment be done with the engine off and with any electric fuel pumps turned off. This is going to reduce the chance of spillage, which could lead to fire. A good initial setting, and the one that comes from the factory, should have the fuel level roughly in the middle of the sight window. It's a good place to start, but experimenting above or below that slightly, that's perfectly fine to do. The way you perform this adjustment is using a 5/8 wrench, go down over the adjustment nut, and using either a Phillips or a standard flat blade screwdriver, break the lock screw loose. A turn of the adjusting nut clockwise will lower our float level, whereas counterclockwise will raise it. When you get it to where you want, go ahead and lock the lock screw back down, and we're sure that we won't have any leaks. Now, it's a good idea to only loosen the lock screw as much as necessary to prevent any excess fuel from coming out, and it just further reduces the chance of there being a fire. Now, if your adjustment was to increase the float level, you'll notice that immediately as soon as you turn the fuel pump back on or start the engine. However, if your adjustment was to lower the float level, you're going to have to wait until the engine has run a little bit to go ahead and burn off that excess fuel that is above the new setting. One final note. We do not recommend the use of the nylon needle and seat gaskets. They're a good bit thicker than the paper or gasket material ones, and they limit the range of adjustability you're going to have with the needle and seat. We're now ready to set our idle mixture screws. This is an adjustment that would need to be done with the engine running. However, since this car is pretty loud, we're going to go ahead and go through it with the engine off. But keep in mind, you need to perform this with your engine running. You'll remember that we got the water temperature up to about 160. And the one thing we need to make sure is that our butterflies are back to their initial closed position. Some of you may have used the idle speed screw to achieve the 2,000 RPM that was necessary to warm up the motor, so return them back to their initial setting. One thing before we start that we need to make sure that we're aware of is that at idle, there should be no fuel coming from the boosters. If there is fuel coming out of the booster, it's generally the result of one of three things. Either, one, our float level is too high. Two, our butterflies are still open too much. That generally results in a pretty high idle, though. Or three, the fuel pressure is too high. We need to get this corrected before we can accurately adjust our idle mixture screws. If the engine started easily, idles smoothly at an acceptable RPM, produces a clean exhaust, and has no off-idle stumble, we suggest you leave the idle mixture screws at their current adjustment. If this is not the case, we need to do some tuning. A black, sooty exhaust is an indication of an over-rich idle circuit. To correct this, we're going to turn each of the 4 idle mixture screws in 1/8 to 1/4 of a turn until the exhaust cleans up. We will use our idle speed screw to readjust to the desired idle RPM. If we have a clean exhaust and no off-idle stumble, we're in good shape. If the exhaust is clean but there is an off-idle stumble, it's an indication of a lean idle circuit. To correct this, we want to turn each of the 4 idle mixture screws out 1/8 to 1/4 of a turn. We will continue this process until the stumble goes away, again using the idle speed screw to adjust the idle RPM. Most tune-ups will require an adjustment of between 1 and 2.5 turns out from the bottom position against the metering block. If your final tune-up results in an adjustment that is outside of this range, but the vehicle starts easily, idles smoothly, has a clean exhaust, and no off-idle stumble, that's okay. If you cannot achieve this type of operation, though, you may need to make further modifications to your idle circuit. If you are troubled with a high idle that you can't seem to get rid of, it's an indication that the idle circuit is lean. There's two quick tests to prove that. One, take a toothpick with a round tip and insert it into one of the idle air bleeds. If this causes the RPM to drop, the circuit was lean. If a toothpick isn't handy, you can depress on the accelerator pump arms and deliver a shot from the squirter. If this excess fuel causes the RPM to drop, again, the circuit was lean. An engine that seems to float from a higher RPM on its way back to idle is another indication of a lean idle circuit. There's two other hints I'd like to give you when tuning on a carburetor. One, it is necessary to keep the air bleed area clean. WD-40 is a great tool to blast any debris out of this area. This will help not only with idle, but with the performance of the carburetor through the entire range. One other thing to keep in mind is that the bowl screws will need to periodically be snugged up. This will help keep the carburetor sealed up properly. A good rule of thumb is to check these every time that you change oil. The squirter is another component that plays a key role in whether or not a carburetor has a stumble. The squirter is located between the air bleed bosses on both primary and secondary if it is a mechanical secondary carburetor, and only on the primary if it's a vacuum secondary carburetor. The squirter delivers fuel from the accelerator pump during quick throttle position changes to help compensate for the quick increase in airflow. Squirters all come with a rating. There's a number on them that is representative of the orifice size located in each leg. The larger the number on the squirter, the larger the orifice is in the legs, and the quicker it will deliver the pump shot. A squirter with a smaller rating stamped into it has a small orifice in the legs and will deliver a longer, more prolonged pump shot. Squirter removal is easy. Simply remove the squirter screw and take the squirter away. Keep in mind it has a gasket on the bottom of it and on top of it that are necessary for it to seal properly. To install a squirter, you simply reverse the removal process and screw it down till it's tight. Good carburetor performance is reliant upon having a good, adequate fuel system. Gasoline carburetors require between 6 and 7.5 psi at idle and full throttle. Alcohol carburetors perform best with 3 to 4 psi of fuel pressure at idle and around 9 to 11 at full throttle. Failure to maintain adequate fuel pressures not only can hurt your performance, but can also lead to engine damage. That's why Demon Carburation recommends the use of BG Fuel Systems fuel delivery components. They offer a complete line of pumps, regulators, and filters for all your fuel system needs. You can call 706-864-8544 to get the address of the dealer nearest you. A good way to determine if your fuel system is adequate is to do the 1-gallon can test. What you need to do is go purchase a 1-gallon gas can from your local hardware store or auto parts store and cut a hole in it large enough to fit the lines from your regulator into the can. Due to the fact we're going to fill this can, and there may be some overage or spillage, I suggest you take your 1-gallon can that's been cut and place it inside of a larger bucket to contain any possible spills. You now take your regulator, which has been set to the proper operating pressure for your application, and insert the regulator lines into the can. But I first want to talk about setting a regulator. Most fuel systems require the pressure to be set with the engine at idle. setting a dead-headed regulator, or one that has no flow coming out of it, leads to an inaccurate reading that is useless. So keep in mind, when you set your regulator, you want your engine running. Now, the best way to do this test is to have two people, one holding these lines and one running the fuel pump. We're going to take our lines now and hold it into the can. We would then have our buddy turn the fuel pump on, and we would time how long it took to fill this 1 gallon can. Now, if you've got a car that runs in the 12s, you should be able to fill that can in less than 35 seconds. If you've got an 11-second car, you need to be able to do it in less than 30 seconds. A 10-second car should fill the can in less than 25 seconds. A 9-second car in less than 20 seconds. An 8-second car in less than 15 seconds. And if you've got a 7-second car, you need to be able to fill that can in less than 12 seconds. One other thing that you want to make sure you keep on hand when you're performing this test is a fire extinguisher. Hopefully you won't need it, but if there's any incidences, it's good to have it nearby.